Greetings. In the last mini lecture, I tried to get across the notion, as you could see, that James David Barber was trying to classify presidents to distinguish differences between them. And he did this by looking at the activity level and the enjoyment of job. And Barber's point wasn't that there's only one category of president that can be successful, because obviously you see examples at all levels. But certainly he did startle people, and it was amazing that while Richard Nixon was kind of on the top of the world and doing very, very well, that he was able to analyze Nixon's personality and come to the conclusion that if he was reelected, his second term would be disastrous, which of course it turned out to be. Barber did have a clear preference, the active positives, people like Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy. But as you could see, in those categories, George Washington is one of the great presidents, and he was a passive negative president. Some believe that President Eisenhower, who was also a very successful president, was also passive negative. I'm not as convinced as Barber that Eisenhower really was a passive negative. I actually believe that Eisenhower was a much more active president than we think. There's a very good book out on that by Fred Greenstein, the Princeton political scientist, who wrote a book called The Hidden Hand Presidency about Eisenhower, claiming that he did a lot of his work behind the scenes. And I'll talk about that today. So I want to move out of the Barber scheme from last time and talk about a scheme that isn't nearly as well known. This is by Alexander George, who for many years was a political scientist at Stanford. And essentially what Alexander George was trying to do with presidential advisory systems was to analyze presidential personality by looking at how he interacted with the people who were closest to them. And George makes the claim that since World War II, presidents have organized their staffs in three very, very different ways. And in this mini lecture, I want to talk about the three models. And in your notes, you don't have the diagram. So after I talk about each model, maybe even before I talk about each model, I will show you the diagram. But why don't I just read off what's in your notes, make a few comments, and then show you the model. So the first model we see with Franklin Roosevelt. The goal of the competitive model was to maximize efficiency by giving staffers duplicate tasks. So when you take a look at my diagram, and here I'll put the diagram up right now. So there's the diagram. There, it's in there. So you see FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. You can see in the diagram that you have four staffers. They've all been given the same task. If you take a look at the arrows flow to Roosevelt, and by that what I mean is that Roosevelt has given these staffers a job. The staffers do not know who the other people are who are working on this project. They all report directly to Roosevelt. So the good thing about this model is you have a president who's very, very engaged. In fact, Roosevelt is the only person who knows what's going on in this case. The reason for the competition is Roosevelt believes that if he has these advisors competing with one another, they will put out their best work possible for obvious reasons. If three of the advisors give Roosevelt an excellent report and one gives the president very weak information, then that person is going to be excluded in future meetings. So these people are going to work very hard. Roosevelt's going to get very good information. The president is actively engaged. So this really looks like a good model. Well, it does, except you have to have a certain type of personality to flourish in this model. First of all, you have to be a president who likes conflict, because you can imagine what this White House is going to be like. If you have advisors that are always competing for the president's attention, you're going to have a very cool, a very distant, a very aloof White House. Roosevelt called this creative conflict. He liked it. So if you're someone like Ronald Reagan who doesn't like conflict, who wants advisors to get along, this isn't going to work. Second, the president is very, very involved, and that sounds like a positive. But if you're more passive, if you are not incredibly active, if you don't have a lot of physical energy, you're going to get overwhelmed in this model. Passive presidents aren't going to be able to handle this model. Presidents who don't like conflict aren't going to be able to handle this model. So the question is not, is this a good model or is this a bad model? The question is, does this model fit the personality of the president? For this president, for Franklin Roosevelt, this model worked fantastic. Unfortunately, the worst thing about this model is what happens if the president dies, which is what happened in this case. As your textbook points out, Harry Truman, the vice president, had only met the president on 3 occasions. The vice president was unaware of progress being made on the atomic bomb. And when Roosevelt died, advisors went rummaging through desk drawers trying to get information for the new president. But a lot of information died with the president. The new president, Truman, inherited this model. Truman liked advisors to meet face to face. He wanted them to interact. And for people who had been competing for a decade in some cases, they just simply were not going to cooperate. So Truman inherited this model, and many critics believe that some of the early missteps of the Cold War was Harry Truman being stuck in an advisory system that simply didn't work. So Truman leaves the White House. We get a new president, President Eisenhower. Eisenhower was president from January of 1953 until January of 1961. He brings a new model that you can follow along in your notes, is the formalistic model. The formalistic model looks like a military chain of command model. If you get a question on the exam about this model, it's going to be one out of 2 things. Either first, this is the most common form of staffing, or 2, in this model of staffing, the chief of staff is typically the most important staffer to the president. I will put this model up for you. You can take a look at it. As you can see, and there's the model. So Eisenhower's at the top, not at the center. You see right below him the chief of staff. The chief of staff was a man named Sherman Adams. Below Adams, people reported upward like a military chain of command. For those of you who have taken sociology, information flows from the bottom to the top, decision making from the top to the bottom. So this looks like Max Weber's idealized bureaucracy. Sherman Adams was by far the most powerful staffer ever in American history. Every single advisor who got in to see President Eisenhower had to be approved by Sherman Adams first. Every memo that got to President Eisenhower had to be approved by Sherman Adams first. And it led to a popular joke in Washington, and the joke was, wouldn't it be horrible if President Eisenhower died, because then we would be stuck with Richard Nixon as our president? And the second man in the joke goes, yeah, that would be bad. But what would be far worse is if Sherman Adams died, because then Eisenhower would be president. And of course, the argument was that Sherman Adams was so powerful, he was the puppeteer, and Dwight Eisenhower was the puppet. Let me give you another example of a president and a chief of staff who did things very different. This would be Richard Nixon and his chief of staff, a man named H.R. Haldeman. And when H.R. Haldeman was asked by a reporter, Mr. Haldeman, what's your job as Nixon's chief of staff? Mr. Haldeman's famous response was, quote, every president needs a son of a bitch. I'm Nixon's buffer and his bastard. In other words, we play good cop, bad cop. I take the political heat. I do the political mud wrestling so that people get so angry at me, they stop paying attention to the president. This releases the president to go out and concentrate on governing the country while I'm engaged in the day-to-day politics of Washington. So that relationship between the president and the chief of staff is crucial because that really determines what kind of White House you're most likely to have. One of the real problems in Donald Trump's White House is that we've now had multiple chiefs of staff, and it doesn't seem like the president listens to any of them. He instead relies on his own gut instincts, and that can be good or bad depending on how good the gut instincts of the president are. Eisenhower leaves the scene. We get a new president, President Kennedy. President Kennedy brings a whole new model to the White House called the collegial model. The goal or the objective of the collegial model was to stimulate discussion and debate. I will put the diagram back up to the screen for you. So you can see in this particular case that you return the president, in this case President Kennedy, to the center. Notice I have those same four advisors advising the president, but notice how different this is than Franklin Roosevelt. In the case of Roosevelt, those information arrows flowed only to the president. In the case of Kennedy, these four advisors are sitting down with the president face to face. They are discussing their options. The president has the advisors there so that they will interact with one another. They will all bring their strongest ideas and debate with one another. And the idea is that through the rough and tumble of politics, that strong ideas will be forwarded and weak ideas will be ignored. So what are the good things about this model? Well, the good thing about this model is, once again, you have a president very, very involved. In fact, you have to have somebody incredibly active to engage in this, because this model is going to take by far the most time to get resolution, to get solutions to problems. So if you're a passive president, this isn't going to work. You also have to have lots of conflict, because the idea here is for people to get their political spears out, to harpoon the ideas, to try to expose the weaknesses in the ideas, and for the group to eventually come to a consensus. The beauty of this model is, when it works, it can work really well because everyone has a stake in the solution. They're far less likely to go out and leak to the press. Once again, the bad news: if you're passive, it won't work. If you don't like conflict, it won't work. Now, I forgot to point out the pluses and minuses of the formalistic model. I got too excited to get to the collegial model. So let's look at the model that Eisenhower employed, and that Nixon employed, and that most people employ. The beauty of this model is, if you're not as active, you can delegate. You can delegate to your chief of staff if you really trust them. You can even bring in additional advisors if you like. So if you're more passive, this works. The problem with this model is there's a very thin line between being an assistant to the president as chief of staff and taking on presidential duties yourself. And so critics of this model say that one of the biggest problems of the formalistic, or your book refers to this model as the hierarchical model. It's the same thing. So if you read hierarchical, think formalistic. In this particular case, as chief of staff, or even if you're down a level or two, you may take on presidential duties yourself. There's an old story of Jack Valenti, who was Lyndon Johnson's special assistant, who talked about the dangers of being a presidential assistant when he said, you sit next to the Sun King and you bask in his rays, and you have those three magic words the president wants. And all of a sudden you have power unimagined before you got in that role. Your arrogance sinks deeper and deeper into your veins than you think possible. What it does after a while is breed a kind of insularity that keeps you from being subject to the same fits of insecurity that most human beings have, because you're seen in the magazines and newspapers. Everyone tells you how important you are. And pretty soon the temptation is to overstep your boundaries and to take on duties that really are designed for the president and for the president only. next time we talk about the Constitution and the presidency.